While wrestling is a business often built on family lineages, it doesn't mean the same talent the parent has always transfers over to the children. Sure, there have been plenty of cases of second and even third generation stars making a huge splash, folks like Cody Rhodes, The Rock, or Roman Reigns. But what about those people who haven't lived up to the expectations? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at today. So join us as we take a deep dive into couldn't match up, failed second generation wrestlers. And if we're going to start anywhere, why not do so with one of the most notorious examples of this phenomenon ever? Because despite arguably being the greatest in-ring performer of all time, Ric Flair's son David was never able to reach the same level as him. Now sure, this may seem like an impossible expectation to have for someone at first glance, as even if they were pretty good overall, asking a young performer to be on the same level as the Nature Boy is quite frankly ridiculous. But we're still going to include David Flair in this video anyway, because it wasn't just a case of him being okay in his own right. No, he was pretty bad even if you don't account for his family name. Why was that? Well, his skills in the ring were rudimentary at best, and his charisma levels were through the floorboards, meaning there was nothing for fans to really grasp onto with him. Even when his dad took him under his wing during the latter days of WCW, and tried to give him the rub in fact, it was clear pretty quickly that the whole thing just wasn't going to work. Of course, that's not to say that David didn't have some measure of success. No, he did get a screwy win over Dean Malenko at one point, and even briefly became a WCW World Tag Team Champion with Daphne. Then once that was over, he entered into a relationship with Stacy Keibler both on and off screen, and used this to keep himself somewhat relevant up until the point the Southern Wrestling promotion went under in 2001. But let's be real here, these are pretty slim pickings when it comes to anyone's standards of a win, and once his time in Atlanta was over, the Minneapolis native did little of note outside of a couple of brief cameo appearances in both WWE and TNA. And considering we know the Flair family does have a lineage for great wrestling in the form of Charlotte, it only makes David's failures stand out that much more. Maybe if he hadn't been pushed so hard so quickly then, and had instead been given some time to develop, things would have been different. But alas, that's not the way things went, just as our next subject is destined to be remembered the same way, and that's David San Martino. And yes, again, we know that being the son of one of the greatest of all time puts an unreasonable amount of expectation on someone's shoulders, and so when they can't live up to what was set before them, it's not necessarily their fault. That said, even if David San Martino wasn't the son of the legendary Bruno San Martino, longest reigning WWF champion of all time, he just never really stood out. Why was this? Well, perhaps it's because back in the mid-80s WWF, in order to stand out, you had to be something really special. After all, let's not forget this was the era of larger-than-life characters such as Hulk Hogan, Macho Man Randy Savage, and Rowdy Roddy Piper. So while the Pittsburgh native certainly did have some solid skills in the ring when it came to the actual wrestling part of the job, he just didn't have the charisma required to make it in the golden era. Could it have been different had he come along a decade or so earlier during a time when it was all about treating things as a real sports contest? Maybe, but then maybe not, because as we all saw when he was paired up with his dad in 1984, even then he looked small time compared to the real star of the show. Hell, at times it felt like it was only his association with the Italian strongman that was keeping him in any kind of notable position on the card at all, as when they weren't teaming together, David was usually relegated to an undercard spot instead. So really, it was a no-win situation for him overall then. Either he lived in his father's shadow and used this to give him a boost, or he went on his own and slowly descended into jobberdom. Still, such a reality didn't stop him from plugging away at his craft anyway, as at one point after jumping over to Vern Gagne's American Wrestling Association, he'd be able to use that status he had to get into a notable program with the then NWA World Champion, Stan Hansen. Unfortunately though, this ended up being the peak of his career, as after that, the San Martino son pretty much disappeared from wrestling altogether, outside of the odd cameo appearance for the likes of the WWF and WCW. That said, he's managed to make a success of himself outside the ring in the years since, as he currently works in his hometown of Pittsburgh as a personal trainer, a vocation he's been carrying out since 1996. But what if you didn't have such a thing to fall back on? What if wrestling is in your blood so much that it feels like the only career path available to you? Well, that's exactly the situation our next subject found themselves in, and it made it sting all the harder when Eric Watts failed to live up to the legacy of his father. Let's backtrack a second, however, because for those who aren't already aware, Eric Watts' dad is none other than Bill Watts, legendary territory performer and eventual promoter of Mid-South Wrestling. And he wasn't just any regular promoter either. No, out of all the people who ran their own territories during the heyday of the National Wrestling Alliance, you could argue he was one of the most successful of them all. Seriously, you'd have to place him way up there alongside the likes of Vince McMahon Sr., Jim Crockett, Sam Mushnick, and Paul Boesch if you wanted to get a true sense of his success. So it's just a shame that when his son came of age in the early 90s and Bill tried to use his political power to get him pushed to the top of the card, things just never really played out the way he'd hoped it might. Why was this? Well, by such a point in time, the patriarch of the family was serving as the booker for WCW, and there the talent level was pretty high overall. And this meant even if his son did have the name behind him, when he stood up next to performers such as Sting, Vader, and Ric Flair, Eric just couldn't help but look like a rookie by comparison. Of course, this didn't stop Bill from continuing to push him as if he was on that level anyway, something which led to frequent accusations of nepotism being thrown his way. And it was probably this which ended up being the final nail in the coffin for the rookie, because even if he did improve over time, it was hard for anyone to look at him any other way. Still, it could have been worse, because at the very least he was capable of being a decent wrestler when the time called for it. It's just a shame the same can't be said for the son of another high-profile figure in WCW then. Who are we talking about here? Why, Garrett Bischoff, of course. And before you say it, we know Eric Bischoff was never exactly a gifted in-ring performer in his own right. Anyone who's ever seen one of his matches can attest to that fact. But what he was a business-savvy executive who managed to take the Atlanta-based Southern Wrestling Company out of the doldrums and turn it into what was, for a little while at least, the biggest promotion on the planet. Obviously, as time went on though, World Championship Wrestling went the way of the dodo, and so it was left to new upstarts like TNA to try and carry on its legacy. And this is where Garrett entered the picture, because by then, his dad had taken up a role as executive producer on the show. So feeling like he could use his backstage sway to get his son an opportunity, Eazy-E did what Bill Watts had done years before and started pushing Garrett to get a prominent spot on Impact every week. The only problem with this, though, was that it was clear upon his debut that the youngest Bischoff just wasn't ready for the role. Needless to say then, this upset hardcore fans of TNA to no end, as with them already seeing Eric and Hulk Hogan taking the company in a direction they didn't like, the inclusion of Garrett Bischoff just served as the final insult. Seriously, why was the son of an executive who had no business being in the spot he was in taking TV time away from the likes of AJ Styles and Samoa Joe? That was the question everyone had on their minds at the time, and it was what eventually led to the whole push having to be downscaled as, come 2014, after a time as part of Aces and Eights, Garrett would leave TNA behind altogether when it became apparent he just wasn't going to make it as a superstar. That said, at least he can take some solace in the fact that he wasn't the only person who was pushed on account of their family name in Nashville in the early 2010s, because, well, Eazy-E was desperately trying to make his boy a thing. Hulk Hogan was doing the same with his daughter, Brooke. And honestly, to even call her a wrestler would be stretching things, as she really was only ever in TNA to try and help boost her career as a singer and reality TV star. But with the Hulkster being her dad, none of this really mattered in the end, as he had so much backstage power he was able to turn her into a regular on-screen character anyway. Basically, it all began in May of 2012. That was when it was first announced that Brooke had signed a deal with the, at the time, #2 promotion in North America to serve as an on-screen authority figure. Of course, while in a different era, her apparent lack of knowledge of the industry might have been enough to turn her into a successful heel, at this point in time, fans were already so sick of the WWE light product TNA was becoming, they wanted nothing to do with her or anything she represented about the future of the company they'd come to know and love. But even in spite of this wave of disdain from fans, it didn't stop her father from continually pushing her on-screen character in more and more prominent ways anyway. In fact, come early 2013, Brooke was involved in one of the biggest angles TNA had going when she and Bully Ray started having a secret kayfabe relationship. Hell, this even led to a wedding segment between the two on the January 10th episode of Impact that year, a segment which couldn't have been further from the original mission statement of the company. And it was the failure of this which eventually led to the plug being finally pulled on the whole Brooke Hogan experiment, as pretty soon thereafter, she'd leave the ring behind and instead return to her original career of trying to find fame any way it could come to her. Yes, sometimes a second-generation star just doesn't have the ultimate goal of making it as a wrestler. No, sometimes it's just a launching pad to something they see as being greater. But that's not always the case, because there are many children of legends who still feel like carrying on that in-ring legacy is their destiny. And few people have personified this attitude more than Richie Steamboat. Of course, even if Richie has proven himself to be a talented guy overall, and certainly someone who has the chops to maintain a lengthy career in the wrestling industry, the fact remains he's always going to have the albatross around his neck of being the son of Ricky the Dragon Steamboat. Yes, no matter how good he may be, the reality is that he's never going to be as good as his dad. And this is something which haunted him throughout his 4-year period as part of the WWE developmental roster between 2009 and 2013. Hell, so much did it hobble him right out of the gate that even if he was holding his own alongside future superstars such as Seth Rollins, Husky Harris, and Big E, it still felt like he should have been doing more. But to be fair, Richie could have done more had time been on his side. In fact, if things worked out differently, then there's every possibility he'd be on the main roster today, having blow-away matches week in and week out. Sadly though, we'll never find out if this was destined to happen, as in December of 2013, the Steamboat's son picked up a back injury which ended up forcing him to retire from the ring altogether. And yes, given the advances in medical technology, there's always the possibility he'll be able to return again in the future, but as it stands right now, his time as a performer is done, and because of that, he's most likely going to go down as yet another example of a failed second-generation star. Still, at least Richie Steamboat maintains the respect of his peers, the same of which can't be said for a man who managed to piss off just about everyone in the Invasion-era WWE locker room. That's right, it's time to talk about the cautionary tale that is Shawn Stasiak. Take a man with the perfect physique for Vince McMahon's idea of sports entertainment, someone who also had that all-important lineage as his father was former WWF World Champion Stan Stasiak, and tell us he wasn't destined for big things. Well, under most circumstances, we wouldn't be able to say this, but when it came to the California native and his time in the industry during the turn of the millennium, he pretty much caused his own downfall. Sure, part of this was the fact that he was never anything more than average in the ring, certainly not a wrestler who could work on the same level as his dad. In fact, during his initial run with WWF in 1999, his whole gimmick was that he was nothing more than a buff guy who women could lust after, which was exactly why he was named Meat. But that's not really what killed his run before it could ever get going. No, it was backstage issues that proved to be Shawn's true downfall. What were these backstage issues? Well, for some unknown reason, he liked to record private conversations of wrestlers backstage, something which brought nuclear heat down upon him once this was discovered. So obviously at this point, any hopes he had of being a top guy in New York were over, and instead, he'd be forced to make the jump to WCW, where he found some level of success by becoming a 3-time tag champion alongside Chuck Palumbo. But even those glory days wouldn't last forever, because when Ted Turner's company went out of business in 2001 and WWF bought up all the remaining contracts, it meant the former Meat would find himself back in the place he least wanted to be. Yes, now working for a company where he had no allies, Stasiak would be reduced to playing ridiculous undercard characters like Planet Stasiak, with this hobbling any potential he had left of being a star. That said, he wasn't the only person who got his start with Vince McMahon in the 90s that also failed to meet the expectations of his family name. Though in the case of Scott Putsky, the fact that he was so woefully miscast once he joined WWF full-time in 1997 meant that he was always going to look like a bit of a joke. Why was this? Well, despite weighing 260 pounds and looking altogether shredded, Scott was given the task of trying to help get the company's then fledgling light heavyweight division off the ground by having a series of bouts over the titular belt with Brian Christopher. Needless to say then, the fact that he couldn't have been further from a light heavyweight immediately made the whole thing look ridiculous and pretty much killed any hopes the Austin native had of rising any higher up on the card right after that. Still, at least he had WCW to fall back on, right? Well, not really, because after making the jump over there in 1998, he'd quickly find himself once again being pegged as a cruiserweight for some unknown reason, meaning the people he'd be put in the ring with, names such as Chris Jericho and Billy Kidman, were easily able to outclass him on account of their high-flying abilities. Perhaps in hindsight then, the solution should have been to just push Scott Putsky as a heavyweight instead and let him sink or swim based on his strengths. But at the time, that just wasn't in the cards for him, and so instead his legacy today is that of someone who was in the wrong role for the entirety of his run in the big leagues, and because of that, his true potential will always remain something of a mystery. One person whose potential is no mystery, though, is our next subject, because when he joined the WWE main roster in 2007, his talents were on display for all the world to see. And given the fact that he's the son of Jimmy Snuka, it only makes Deuce's failure stand out that much more. But wait, we hear you ask, Deuce of Deuce and Domino, one half of that late 2000s 50s throwback team on SmackDown, was the kin of the Superfly? Well, yes. While it wasn't hugely promoted at the time, he did indeed share a family lineage with the man who once famously jumped off the top of the steel cage in Madison Square Garden. That said, while he might have shared blood with the WWF legend, his father's skills in the ring clearly didn't carry on to him, because when he made his Blue Brand debut in 2007, there was nothing about the youngster which stood out at all other than his ridiculous gimmick. Yes, it is true that at one point Deuce managed to become a tag team champion under this gimmick for a brief time, and after this, the company tried to repackage him as Sim Snuka. Unfortunately, by this point though, barely anyone cared enough to even notice. But at least he wasn't the only one who failed to get over at this point in time, despite having a famous father in the industry, because this was the period when Randy Orton was trying to get his new Legacy stable off the ground. And while that stable did eventually do wonders for Cody Rhodes, and to a lesser extent Ted DiBiase Jr., it sadly wouldn't have the same effect for both Sim and our next subject today, Manu. That's right, Manu, the son of Afa and cousin to the likes of The Rock, Roman Reigns, and Yokozuna, certainly had a high watermark to live up to when he first hit the indie circuit in 1998. Unfortunately, while he may have been okay at what he did though, that just wasn't good enough for a member of the famed Anoa'i family. No, this was arguably the most successful group of performers in the history of the industry we were talking about here. One which was right up there with the likes of the Harts, the McMahons, and the Guerreros. So when Manu turned out to be average in the ring at best, all it did was shine a brighter light on him and his inadequacies as a result of this. But that didn't stop WWE from at least trying to do something with him when they briefly made him the newest protege to the Viper during the end of the 2010s. It's just a shame then that Manu was so unimpressive to his bosses here that the plug would be pulled on his inclusion in the Legacy so quickly, many have now forgotten he was even part of it at all. And it's equally as big a shame that following this demotion, the son of Afa would be cut from his contract altogether, with this forcing him to return to the indie circuit instead, where he's since had to find works with the likes of the World Wrestling Council and Pennsylvania Premier Wrestling. Sure, he would make the most of this by winning some gold in these places, but those belts are so small time in comparison to what he could have been taking home, it's hard to even call this success. But then we guess that's the way things go sometimes, even if you do have the family lineage behind you, because at the end of the day, a name can only take someone so far, and if you don't have it at that point, then nothing's gonna make you a star.